Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is going to be a unplanned second episode in a series about rethinking personality disorder. My first one, gosh, I don't even know when that was. Might have been 2 years ago. It was one of my first ones. Also, I hadn't figured out the audio back then, but it was talking about essentially this concept that personality theory, personality work has really been, I think I called it kind of marooned on an island somewhere and rejected and neglected in sort of really damaging ways, which puts providers, actual practitioners in the lurch, and also vicariously puts prospective clients in the lurch. And in doing so, there's a lot of pop psych around personality. And today, in the second episode, I want to correct this a little bit. I still believe it to be marooned on an island somewhere. But as I've been reading and researching it, I should note, one, there's a lot of actually professionals on that island. Doesn't change the fact that they've marooned themselves, and us on the mainland are like, I don't know what the hell you're doing over there, so I'll try to avail what I know about that. And in doing so, talk a lot about this idea or this juxtaposition and the dilemma between kind of trait-based and dimensional models versus the categorical models, which I have talked ill about, and I will continue to talk ill about. And at the end of the day, my recommendation still remains the same. I think psychodynamic theory is an important bridge that already currently exists for anybody who's having to exist and work on this stuff while the professionals try to figure out what they want to do. It is still, to this day, I think one of the best resources we have. So, what's going on this island? Well, over the last several decades, particularly with the DSM-5, it was interesting to read that fundamentally it is an appreciation that categorical models fail. As I think I said in the first episode, there's a ton of overlap. There are these silly notions that if someone meets multiple criteria for multiple personality disorders, you give them all the personality disorders. It is ridiculous at best. It just basically is proof that there are statistical issues and there are factor analytical issues. There's just these personality disorders, they are emblematic of something important, but they're really not specific enough, and or they are too restrictive to really be of use. And so it was refreshing to see that the people on this island are indeed also criticizing this. An example that they used, which was also terrifying to hear, that they almost considered eliminating narcissistic personality disorder in the DSM-5. That was news to me. Because it was not fully representative of narcissism, which is ridiculous because to me, the DSM captures extremely well a tried and true and absolutely a thing that shows up in the world, the more malignant on the one hand, sort of, but especially the more entitled narcissism. But it doesn't capture all versions of this concept known of narcissism, so we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding me. So thankfully they didn't do that. But the folks who kind of posit that there's like trait ways of understanding personality disorders and the preferred ways to understand the traits, and thereby that is the issue, right? Narcissism is a thing, but as it is currently described, it only describes a very narrow clustering of certain traits and absolutely ignores others. And so these trait folks say, hey, building off of like big five mentalities and that kind of stuff, there's a lot of traits out there that are represented in all personality. And that was one of my other complaints, like how stigmatizing we've made personality psychology. Well, the trait-focused folks go, we can map anybody on these traits. When it becomes quote-unquote disordered is when there are extremes or excesses of certain variables and or a confluence of variables. And that's when we get into what we call disordered personality. But isn't that wonderful? Everybody can map onto these to varying degrees. And oh, by the way, that's going to capture your covert narcissist better too. Because yeah, narcissism loads pretty heavily onto antagonism, great. But it doesn't necessarily load onto aspects of agreeableness and other things that covert narcissists are very adept at doing. So ta-da, traits. So that's one of the arguments, is like we should go to a trait base. And you can find this in the back of the DSM-5 as well as the DSM-5 TR. The TR did absolutely nothing, zero changes as far as I know to personality. So the dilemma has been going on for literally 2 decades, but I digress. So you can go to the back and there's traits specified, and you see them kind of trying to hybridize these things. And what this essentially reflects is there's still a dilemma. It's like we want to do trait-based, but there are problems also with trait-based, right? So here's the rub. when they've done research apparently on the trait-based ones, and they give it to practitioners and have the practitioners actually rate the people with whom they are meeting, right? Rather than having the client self-report, a whole bunch of traits kind of rise to the top more and beyond what is currently conceptualized. And so it sounds like they're like, well, we have this great theory around common traits and stuff, but my goodness, we give it to a bunch of practitioners, and even more sort of like potential signs and symptoms and things are coming up, and they're I imagine them being like, crap, what do we do with that? Right? Like, we've got to figure out a way to make this work. The other complaints that are rightfully leveraged against trait-based is like these constructs, these diagnoses as we know them, are not useless. You'll find if you look at my depressive personality disorder, how frustrated I am that there is legit, I have met people, and I am one of them, who have depressive personalities, and we've thrown that baby out with the bathwater. These overarching constructs are useful if we use them very narrowly, in a very categorical, very strict manner that doesn't appreciate the breadth of potential traits that can present, or we could call that subtypes, right? Of how there can be individual differences within the same caption. That overall caption still holds use and utility, right? Like dependent personality disorder has been frequently challenged similarly. They're like, well, anybody can exhibit high levels of dependency, but I can tell you I've met people that are very prototypical and lead with dependent personality disorder. Might I smatter in or kind of put some more raw ingredients of traits into that condition as well, depending on with whom I meet? 100%, just like with borderline personality disorder, just like with other ones too. And so they're like, why would we abandon this? And never mind, clinicians don't think in these broad trait-based mentalities, right? Like that is a huge ask, as useful as it is to think like, here's 3 problematic traits, so I can take a functional approach rather than a diagnostic approach. But most people don't think that way. They look for kind of the overall gestalt or summary and look for a diagnosis generally to guide them. And the public absolutely does this. So, it's noble, I think, to think like, hey, maybe we think about, these are all a sum of many parts, and the parts themselves are more important than the sum often. But we cannot abandon the whole, right? Just because we have a bunch of raw ingredients doesn't mean we don't ever try to make a dish. And that's a dish that a lot of people like, aka a lot of people might fit into that diagnostic category. And so that's where a rub is created, rightfully so. And so I don't know how much is actually a fight, right? But there's this talk of like, so how do we like create hybridized models for this? There's talk of like severity levels. And it's, I think they're frustrating themselves. And to their credit, I think this has been such a like untouched area. If they suddenly change it, they want it to be, giant air quotes, so you're right. They want to do a really good job, because people are not used to like, well, they're doing it now, then in 2 years they're going to update us with even more research. Again, it's been marooned on an island. And so if they're suddenly going to change something, it feels like they really want to get this like really cohesive so that they can just refine it, rather than a few years later, or these DSMs come out every decade, and go, oh, whoops, big changes again. That's my guess. I'm not in the room where it happens. This is part of the problem with this field, is that there's just this huge separation where the powers that be just kind of canoodle over there. And there's not a lot of access, in my experience, to the providers in the field. It's just this massive kind of schism or chasm between the two. But to their credit, again, I think they're trying to be careful and diligent, and they're having really substantive conversations. I mean, it's very refreshing as a psychodynamic provider to be like, oh, so all that stuff I peddle, they're actually considering and trying to figure out a way to fold that in, as well as other important theories, Big Five, et cetera, et cetera. So there you go. That's my update. It's still marooned on an island, but that island, I promise, is inhabited. So forgive me if in episode 1 I was kind of like, nobody gives a shit anymore. Excuse my French. They do. They're just, power dynamics. They're holed up behind behind a lock and key door and not given anything, to the public outside of voracious readers. They're not given much, publicly to announce and kind of bring people and educational systems along for the ride. They're not doing that, which is irresponsible, in my opinion. They need to be better about messaging and communication. All right. All this being said, however, I still believe psychodynamic theory is the key. A lot of where we're landing is fundamentally what psychodynamic theory offers. Now, I think the PDM, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, it can absolutely be improved upon. It is not perfect in its own right, but a potential remedy, a potential resource while we wait for the powers that be to do what they want to do is the PDM. It's the best resource as a provider that I would turn to try to educate yourself on theory. Theodore Milan is another great one. I think that really these professionals and publications that push for more dimensional understandings, and they also push for variance underneath the caption, imperfectly as it might be, but they do a great job of saying, look, all this exists on a continuum, right? Neurotic, borderline, psychotic levels, quote unquote, healthy levels of, personality organization. They appreciate that. And in doing so, force providers and force clientele who are willing to come along for the ride to believe that there's varying degrees of how personality presents and that there's subjectivity in that, but there's flexibility in that. Meanwhile, they're really good at saying, here are typical core critical ways and, critical conflicts and defenses and all these things that you might prototypically see. Amend as you please. By the way, there's introjective and analytic presentations of these. Oh, by the way, here are some commonly observed subtypes over decades of observation. And so you notice they give you a bunch, right? They don't abandon the overarching category, but underneath that category is a whole lot of curiosity and even speculation about neurodevelopment and temperament and those sorts of things to the best of their ability. And unlike the DSM that goes, here's a tiny box, good luck, I'm not going to expand on this at all, they do their due diligence to give us a lot more flexibility and a lot more information to play with. And I think that will still marry pretty darn well with whenever the DSM folks finally decide to publish some sort of change. And I hope it will be a hybridized model. I think it's the wisest, but it is probably the most difficult to disseminate and to teach people. But that doesn't mean we should avoid it just because it's difficult. That's what we're trained to do. We do the difficult stuff and help port that into meaningful conceptualization. And importantly, the other giant missing link here, heaven forbid, a little bit of treatment in the realm of personality psychology. Rather than like, I don't know, go see a CBT guy. I don't know, go see an internal family systems person. I don't know, go see a relational psychodynamic person. I'm sure they know what they're doing, right? I do pretty good, but by golly, I'd love some researchers to look, I don't know, uniquely at these hybridized models of personality and give me a little bit more insight myself based on what would research say could be helpful for treatment. So, all right, so that's the update. There might be future episodes. I don't know. Clearly, again, this one was year two charty, so maybe another one will pop up. But hopefully, a helpful clarification. There's probably some things I missed from the first episode. So if you want to go watch or listen to that, by all means. But as always, one, I love personalities, so look for more of that from me when I have the time. And two, thank you for listening and watching, and stay curious.